ICS was founded in 1980 by Estelle Showett-Bretman, an art historian with an infectious gift for friendship and love for the shared heritage of humanity. Estelle traveled widely, studying ruins and relics, and was one of the first to recognize how the funerary art and inscriptions in Rome's underground burial sites, that is, the catacombs, evidence a deep cultural exchange among Jews, Christians, and traditional polytheistic Romans. Though Estelle is no longer with us, we're pleased to celebrate her legacy tonight in what would have been her centennial year. If you'd like to support our work or to become a member, please visit our website at catacombsociety.org. Members enjoy full access to our archives and to special events, including lectures, catacomb visits, and other programs in New York, such as upcoming tours of churches and heritage sites not normally open to the public. Thank you so much for being here, and I now welcome Michael Peppard to the stage.
Thank you so much. To get to our distinguished speaker as quickly and efficiently as possible, I considered making this a one-sentence introduction, which is this. In the academic areas in which she and I both work, Professor Candida Moss is globally the most significant scholar of our generation. This is not an exaggeration. I could defend it in multiple ways, and it's really all you need to know as we begin. But such a brief introduction would break academic decorum, and it would also deprive you of learning about her breadth and depth. After earning degrees in theology and religious studies from two of the world's leading institutions, a bachelor's from Oxford, a doctorate from Yale, she began her career at the University of Notre Dame. There she earned promotion to full professor at one of the fastest timelines that I've ever heard of, and she's been like the character of Hamilton, 15 blocks down Broadway, nonstop. If you know the show, that was for you. Now she is the Edward Cadbury Professor of Theology at the University of Birmingham. She is the author or editor of at least 10 books, I've lost count, and this all during the first 15 years of her publishing career, with her first book coming out in 2010. Yet she has not sacrificed quality for quantity. In fact, she's been awarded literally the highest global honors for writing about religion. The Grawemeyer Award often looks like a kind of lifetime achievement award, but Professor Moss has already achieved more than a lifetime of scholarly achievement by her midlife. And by the way, that award-winning book is for sale right afterwards at a discount, and she'll be available to sign it. And I carried them in a briefcase, so I don't want to take them home. You should all get one. She's acknowledged by top scholars as worthy of election to the prestigious Academy of Arts and Sciences, but she's also had the broadest public reach of any scholar in our field. CBS correspondent, National Geographic columnist, commentator for multiple video series that bring her scholarly knowledge to a general audience. The primary academic societies for the study of the Bible and the study of the classical world have each awarded her their public outreach awards. As full as this award shelf is, she's always shared her accolades and wisdom with others, most subtly as a mentor in private to younger scholars from all over the world. Finally, and most importantly to me, for 25 years, Professor Moss has been my friend. She's good-humored, a truth teller, a sharp critic who is also compassionate. From her position of excellence and success, she still sees the whole field and reaches out with help. I would guess that her combination of compassion and incisive critical thought is what led her to the topic about which she'll speak tonight. Who wrote your Bible? I mean, who really did the writing? Who put the ancient stylus to papyrus? And what about their lives have we missed through our failures of imagination? So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Candida Moss.
This is going to be such a disappointment after that. Michael, do you know how to? Oh, it's already there. We're good for now. I have an assistant. Thank you so much for that ridiculous introduction. And thank you to the ICS, Michael, Sarah, Shira, and everyone at Fordham for inviting me to speak with you tonight in this very big room. I realize, oh, sorry. The ICS does really invaluable work, and it is a real honor to be able to participate in that work in a very small way. And thank you to all of you for coming. Ryan Gosling is next door at the premiere of his latest movie, so I realize that you had options and maybe made the wrong choice. My talk tonight, as you have already heard, is based in part on my book, God's Ghostwriters, but allow me to start with someone a little better known to you. Sometime in the middle of the 1st century, following a decade of missionary activity in Turkey and Greece, the Apostle Paul set his sights on Rome, the beating heart of Roman imperial power. Though he was filled with certainty about the divine origins of his vocation, Paul had not had an easy time of things. He faced opposition from other leaders of the fledgling Jesus movement, calculatedly brutal punishments, imprisonments, and sleepless nights. But there was something about this particular ambition that made Paul a little nervous. In Roman society, he possessed none of the credentials or personal connections that he had had when he was in Corinth. He had never even been to Rome. Making it in the dazzling chaos of the empire's capital was intimidating. The competition would be intense. Other better credentialed teachers and philosophers already jostled for airtime and patronage. He would not have been the first philosophical teacher to fail to leave his mark on the eternal city. It was with trepidation that he approached this new task of evangelizing in Rome. He could not, as he had done so many times before, just kind of show up, set up shop, and start spreading his message. There were already Jesus followers in Rome who presumably were quite content with their lives and didn't think they really needed a Paul. Paul was known to them by reputation, and so the situation necessitated some kind of finesse. His strategy was to begin with a letter, a carefully considered epistolary magnum opus that would introduce both Paul the man and Paul the theologian to the Roman congregations. In advance of the visit, the details of his argument were worked out in greater detail than anything he had written before. He had to forestall every possible misinterpretation of his argument. And it was well worth the effort. The result of his labor, the letter to the Romans, is widely regarded as the most theologically sophisticated and influential book in the New Testament. There's no questioning its importance, and unlike so many other books in the New Testament, no scholar has ever doubted that Paul himself wrote it. There is one. There is like one scholar who recently wrote a book saying they're all forgeries, but let's just ignore that for now. But this point is remarkable because it is so demonstrably untrue. Paul did not write this letter, or at least he did not write it alone. Tucked into the conclusion of the letter is a simple but striking interruption. I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the Lord. Who is Tertius? Almost every artistic depiction of Paul, from the carefully laid ancient murals of Ravenna to the color-saturated portraits of the Renaissance, shows Paul working alone, quill in hand, engrossed in the act of writing. In some depictions, he looks heavenward, as if asking for or receiving divine inspiration. Rarely is he shown turning to another person, yet here in the letter itself, we find the name of another writer. The most minimalist opinion on the subject is that Tertius was Paul's secretary or amanuensis. As Paul struggled to find the right word or phrase to convey his ideas, Tertius sat dutifully recording every syllable. He was, in other words, one of the tens of thousands of erudite enslaved people who acted as stenographers, transcribed ideas, and edited the literary output of the Roman world. With only a few exceptions, when scholarship describes Tertius, we call him a scribe or a professional or an associate, language that creates the impression that Tertius is some kind of educated volunteer or friend, someone who willingly lent his spiritual skills to his mentor. What we have forgotten is that the people who worked as ancient secretaries were not part of some kind of well-educated middle class who had hobbies of writing things down for other people. They were people whose freedom had been stolen. With a name like Tertius, which simply means third, the man that wrote the letter to the Romans was almost certainly enslaved. Even when Paul was not collaborating on lengthy theological treatises, he also used secretaries. Towards the end of his letter to the Galatians, Paul remarks on his handwriting and invites his readers to see what large letters I make when I'm writing with my own hand. The implication is that everything that preceded that, what amounts to almost the entirety of the letter, was written by someone else in a smaller hand. Paul makes similar statements in other letters, suggesting that this is just his standard practice. This shouldn't surprise us. This, after all, is how most people in the first century wrote. What was true of Paul, arguably the best educated of the apostles, is true of all Christian writers and leaders. Most early Christians used secretaries to transcribe and copy their writings. According to early second century tradition, the Apostle Peter allegedly dictated the gospel to his secretary Mark, a translator, a hermeneutes, who traveled with him, helping him communicate with Greek speakers and navigating local customs. Now, later sources would turn Mark into sort of religious aristocracy. They would say that he was a member of the priesthood and he worked in the temple, but our earliest source pictures him as low status and hints that perhaps he was enslaved. This legend of Peter and Mark might well be apocryphal, but it captures a very real ancient dynamic. People used enslaved actors to read and write. But why? People who were illiterate, as Peter and surely many other early Christians certainly were, used scribes and secretaries to write. And as a profession, secretarial and scribal labor was almost always performed by enslaved or formerly enslaved people. But a lack of education is not the only reason that people employed secretaries. Those who had visual impairments, people who suffered from arthritis or gout, and people who were elderly dictated almost everything that they wrote. What has gone unnoted is just how prevalent these conditions would have been in antiquity. According to the National Eye Institute, approximately 150 million Americans suffer from myopia, hyperopia, astigmatism, and presbyopia, or age-related vision loss, which is what I have. Even apart from extrapolating from modern statistics like this, there is a plethora of evidence to suggest that vision loss was a problem in antiquity too. Papyrological, literary, and archaeological data all indicate the widespread incidence of vision problems in this period. So, according to the data accumulated by von Staden, who went to ancient shrines and collected up all of these votives, which are images of body parts that people have dedicated in temples in exchange for a healing from the god, the most frequent anatomical votive you can find at these healing shrines is of the eyes, suggesting that vision loss is the biggest problem that people had in the ancient world. We also know that temporary vision loss and spontaneous cures of blindness were sort of known to writers like Pliny the Elder and Celsus, as were apparently effective cures. But during bouts of this disease, if you had temporary vision loss, you also would have had to have used a scribe. Age-related issues were also well known. Cicero had several house guests who had to use scribes in order to read and write. To this, we can add mobility impairments involving the hand or thumb that were caused by gout, osteoarthritis, rheumatism, and tuberculosis. All of these conditions could escalate to the point that the sufferer could no longer grip objects or move their thumbs with ease. Gout, or the rich man's arthritis, is commonly associated with the feet. That's what we think of. But it affected the hands after the age of 30. According to Suetonius, the Emperor Galba was so debilitated by gout in his hands and feet that he was unable to unroll or hold a scroll. You have to hold a scroll with both hands and move your thumbs like this. Arthritis was also commonplace. The Numidian grammarian Fronto complains that a lifetime of writing had produced such discomfort that he was no longer able to write by hand himself and had to use a scribe. It's not only people who are disabled or illiterate who utilize servile assistance. Those of means also routinely dictated their opinions and delegated their correspondence to others simply because it's more comfortable. As anyone who recalls taking a written exam knows, this is going to get outdated very quickly. Writing hurts. You have to kind of wring your hand out to deal with the cramps. In the 4th century CE, a friend of Libanius remarks that his enslaved scribe looked quite pale. The Greek here is literally his face is drained of color. And it turns out that endless work is to blame. The man had shut himself away for writing. He probably didn't have much of a choice in the matter. And Libanius's friend says, "Aren't you lucky that your slave is not lazy?" Our takeaway here is that long hours of sitting and writing could make you very sick. The medical writer Celsus repeatedly notes that literary work is actually bad for your body. It will weaken you. In one letter from Oxyrhynchus, dictated by an Egyptian woman named Thasus, her scribe, who's a house guest named Alexandros, complains that he had worn himself out from writing the letter. I find this just very, very funny because it's a very short letter. It has 390 words in it. It has 65 mistakes in the letter. So it's sort of the length of the shortest of the Pauline epistles, and he clearly isn't doing his writing a lot. Alexandros is being a touch dramatic about the burdens placed upon him, but these little subscripts to manuscripts from the medieval period rebelliously bring the body of the copyist into view and express the same sentiment as Alexandros. This late 14th century example implores that the work is written, "Give me a drink. Let the right hand of the scribe be free from the oppressiveness of pain." And this similarly dated manuscript of Lucan's Pharsalia includes this sort of amusing epigraph, "I can't feel my hand, my head's in a whirl, I'd swap my pen for a beautiful girl." So those who are wanting to avoid the discomforts of writing had good reason to use scribes, because writing shapes the body. It forces it to grow accustomed to bodily positions and material relationships that change it. In the ancient Roman world, highly literate individuals learned to write in childhood, seated on the ground or on benches, bent over a writing tablet, a scroll, or maybe an ostracon, a shard of stone that was balanced on their knee. Now, for a child, that position is quite easy. You've probably all seen your children contort themselves into weird positions when they're watching their iPads. But for those who continued on past childhood as sort of professional scribes and literary workers, it becomes a lot more difficult. Over the course of a lifetime, the repetitive motions of Roman bookwork, in particular, writing with a pen and reading from a book roll, would have had a damaging effect on the bodies of scribes and readers. It would have damaged the carpo-metacarpal joint at the base of your thumb, producing arthritis, tendinitis, and other joint-related injuries. The positioning of the body bent over during writing would have affected the necks, spines, and wrists of copyists and scribes. Osteoarchaeological evidence reveals a high proportion of arthritis among ancient population. We have several examples of arthritis in the thumbs that cannot be concretely tied to specific professions, but the best, most persuasive example is this study of osteoarchaeological remains from the 3rd millennium BCE in Egypt. Now, this study is obviously not Roman. We're quite far in advance of the Romans, but everyone included in it was a scribal worker. And the study revealed that everyone in this cemetery for scribes experienced a significantly higher rate of osteoarthritis than the general population, worse than sort of manual laborers. In any case, it is because of all of these factors, illiteracy, disability, declining vision, and discomfort that might over time become disabling, that unlike later generations of enslavers, Romans educated enslaved workers to do their paperwork. And many people from a variety of different social backgrounds utilized the skills of enslaved workers to do their bookwork. If enslaved workers were as common as I'm saying, then why don't we hear more about them? Why didn't we all know that Romans was written by Tertius and Paul? Well, collaboration with enslaved workers is invisible to us because ancient theories of the household pictured enslaved people as extensions of the body of their enslaver. Descriptions of enslaved workers portray them as tools, body parts, or prosthetic devices through which the freeborn master could extend themselves. This idea is present in discussions of literary work as well as kind of agricultural labor. And so we find Marshall writing of his skilled, likely enslaved stenographer, that though words run fast, the hand is faster. Tongue's work is not yet done when hand is finished, as if Marshall and his shorthand writer are part of the same body. And Cicero, in an affectionate tone, writes that without Tiro, his work is silent. Tiro is like his tongue speaking for him. These aren't outlying examples. In the context of writing, the secretary or clerk was sort of regularly described as the hand of the enslaving author, or simply just a hand, as if they're all the same. Language like this imbricates the contributions and agency of the secretary into the figure of the enslaver. The underlying argument is reductive and dehumanizing. Certain people aren't people, they are mindless objects or body parts. And as body parts, they don't threaten the judgment or authority of the author. The reality is a lot more complicated. All work is mindful and all work is embodied. Yet in the ancient model, all decisions and skills are credited to the enslaver, who becomes for us the author. We only see Marshall, we only see Cicero. The cost of this literary accounting scheme is the erasure of unfree collaborators and the mischaracterization of their individual skills, as well as the legacy that they leave. This then leads us to the question of what did they do? If they're there, if they're so prevalent, what are secretaries contributing to the work they produced? Are they just conduits? Ancient enslavers say that they are. They're just mindless body parts. But is that true? Are they just conduits for other people? And I want to suggest that this is not true. We should not trust enslavers of any period on the work of their enslaved people. In fact, ancient secretarial ghostwriting involves an ability to imitate both established modes of writing and the quirks and compositional tells of the person who's speaking, your enslaver. It's imitative, it's mimetic, but it's also creative and constructive. Ancient papyri reveal that secretaries did improve upon the raw material with which they were provided. We know this because when we have papyri, they start off trying to improve the work, and then they get tired and they stop doing it, and it defaults to sort of like all of the sort of words you would want to cut out are preserved there. In addition, studies of secretarial and clerical work from other periods, including our own, show that low-status writers always make powerful and important decisions that affect the final product. Cognitive psychologists would argue that people cannot help but crave agency, and thus it is bad history to dismiss them. Now, it's going to be impossible to prove that Paul's secretaries came up with turns of phrase, rhetorical flourishes, or intellectual arguments that are usually credited to Paul, but there are hints that they might have. In 2 Corinthians 10:10, Paul tells us that his opponent described his letters as powerful and rhetorically weighty, but his oratorical skills are contemptible. Perhaps he's just a bad public speaker. Or maybe he used very well-trained secretaries who helped elevate the character of his writing. Now, in case you're starting to get anxious, many modern Christians worry that this kind of practice of dictation might have corrupted the text, the original message. As corruption has been a watchword in discussions about the transmission of manuscripts, and most of us played the game telephone as children, the concern is real. You know, it's possible they got things wrong. But dictation and its effects do not need to be understood in terms of error. Let me give you an example. So one interpretively important example comes to us from Romans 5. As it is translated in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the passage reads this: "Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ." The Greek manuscripts from which the standard critical editions of the New Testament are produced offer two primary options for the verb. The subjunctive, there you go, the subjunctive ekomen, which means let us have, and the indicative ekomen, which means we have. The former reading, the subjunctive, which was very popular in antiquity, exhorts addressees to make peace with one another. Let us have implies we have to make peace. The indicative tells us that we already have it. We don't have to do anything. It's a statement of fact that expresses the condition that we all already enjoy. One is an instruction and one is not. But what's not obvious to a modern reader is that these words sounded almost identical. So whichever reading, whatever was written down when Paul dictated it to Tertius had to make a decision to choose between one of two almost identical words that sounded almost identical. And the uncertainty we find in the manuscript reflects the auditory interchangeability of the two. My point is this: Tertius, Paul's secretary, wasn't corrupting anything or making a mistake. He was making a decision. That decision shaped the text and its interpretation over the course of nearly 2 millennia. Collaboration does not have to be about corruption. It could just be about cooperation. More broadly, and to get away from just what could be like a hearing and dictation error, let me tell you how bad this gets when you look at shorthand. Dictation could be performed in one of two primary ways. You can dictate syllable to syllable, or you could speed things up by using shorthand. Shorthand looks like this. If you don't know Greek and can't read shorthand, you're in exactly the same position as everyone else in the room who can read Greek, because we still cannot read ancient shorthand. The reason for that is that shorthand involved translation and was very idiosyncratic. Spoken words are translated and condensed into symbols that are then translated and expanded into written words. But shorthand was not learned as part of an elite education. Though theories of its origins vary, the mythology of shorthand says that this is slave knowledge, devised, Seneca says, by the vilest sorts of slaves. Elites learned to write by taking longhand dictation, but there is almost no evidence that affluent people use shorthand writing themselves. It's extremely hard to learn and required specialized training. One contract from the 2nd century CE tells us that it took 2 years to become fully proficient in the skill. My primary point here is that when Paul wrote something, or Seneca wrote something, or Cicero wrote something, and it was transcribed in shorthand, Paul, Seneca, and Cicero could not read what was written down on the page. And the technology of shorthand, it's very vague and amorphous, creates the opportunity for slippage and secretarial expression, because shorthand varies almost from scribe to scribe. What all of this suggests is that most people could not read it, and most elite writers could not read the text that they themselves had written. It was illegible. As Kathleen McNamee has put it, the notes ancient stenographers took had to be transcribed into legible Greek by the same note takers themselves if anyone else was to have access. In practical terms, therefore, the secretary was irrevocably tied to the text. The same scribe who took dictation had to interpret and transcribe their text. They're not interchangeable, fungible workers. They are an inextricable part of the writing process without whom the text is unreadable. And if we want to say that these texts were translated and retranslated perfectly because ancient memories are so good, we need to acknowledge that the excellent memories upon which we are depending are those of the enslaved worker who translated the text and has to remember what was originally said. These practicalities of ancient writing destabilized the imagined power dynamics between author and secretary for elite Romans, early Christians, and modern readers alike. Tertius and others are enslaved, they are legal subordinates, but their work required that they exercise their own judgment in transcribing and editing texts attributed to others. Now we know that they're there and that they mustn't necessarily be making interventions. Some people now say to me, why would they have done it? Why would an enslaved person have made any kind of intervention in a text? Isn't this dangerous? Aren't they a bit busy? Now, I'm not a mind reader, much less a time-traveling mind reader, so it's easier to show you that they did make changes and that they did make interventions than to explain why. So let me show you. We might only have time for one of these examples, but at least one example of people making interventions for inscrutable reasons. This is a transcription of a roof tile from the top of a temple in modern-day Pietrabonte in Italy. This is a very odd place to look for writing, the roof of a temple, but unexpected places are appropriate locations to seek out invisible actors. So sometime during the 1st century BCE, 2 women took a break from the monotony of shaping and laying out roof tiles to press their sandal-clad feet into the soft clay of a freshly made terracotta slab. Having carefully placed their feet in line with one another, they might have actually switched shoes in order to make them perfect. They add an inscription. Above the footprints in Oscan, the language of the local Samnite population, one had written, debt-free, slave of Herennius Satius, signed with her foot, and under the footprints in Latin, her friend had inscribed Amica, slave of Herennius, left her mark when we were making tiles. The roof tile had not even been fired when they marked it, but this remnant of friendship found its way onto the temple roof where the inscription was hidden from view. I love this artifact. It is irresistible to me because it defies any academic generalization about literacy, gender, and affluence. These are enslaved women who, broadly speaking, are engaged in construction work. And not only that, they can read, they can write, they can compose full sentences. Despite their ostensible differences, one of them has a Latin name and the origins of the other name are unknown, this friendship has blossomed. Bilingual inscriptions can be found from all over the Roman Empire. But why were enslaved women who could read and write, and in Amica's case, speak multiple languages, making roof tiles? And were they disciplined for defacing the tile, or did this act of quasi-vandalism go unnoticed? Perhaps Amica, which just means friend, if you've taken any Latin, you know that, and debt-free, the meaning of which is unknown, were pseudonyms or pet names, assumed here to avoid detection. And we have to wonder, were the women still there when the site was annihilated by the Roman general Sulla a few years later? Perhaps this is an example of resistance, an insistent claim to presence that resisted hierarchies of erasure. Perhaps it's just a moment of fun, poking through the mantle of control. Perhaps this is about love or just friendship. The tile is a glimpse at real agency and sociality, and herein lies its greatest significance. It is widely recognized that enslaved people acted as agents of enslavers. They could draw up contracts, they could buy and sell things, they can strike bargains, they can make loans, they can even purchase other human beings, and we acknowledge that as scholars. But when it comes to the writing of what we call high literature, and to the development of ideas and concepts, we are reluctant to see their influence. And I think this tile suggests that we should rethink that. I'm going to skip my next example, so we have time for Q&A, so we have to skip 2 slides. And this reveals another reason people might have used scribes in antiquity. I have an assistant who is clicking through the scribes for me, because I have 2 different systems. Anyone here who works on sources in the combination of sources into a single text should wonder just how many people it would have taken to combine multiple Gospels or Gospel sources into a single text. But what you really want is something more than just sort of a principle that slaves are there and they're doing stuff. What you really want is to know how might enslaved collaborators have changed the Bible. And in the case of the Bible, even small tweaks have an outsized impact. No set of books is as discussed and dissected as the New Testament. Scholars and religious leaders alike pore over the language of the evangelists. Doctrinal battles are fought over the meaning of Paul's prepositions, with constant recourse to our understanding of what the authors intended. Any modification, however small, has affected the course of Christian theology. If that Romans example seemed obscure to you, it really shouldn't. These debates cross from the pulpit to the public domain in modern cultural debates about what the Bible meant in the past and means in the present. An excellent secretary or copyist is usually undetectable to us. We only see them when they make mistakes. But they're always there, actively co-authoring and making decisions that affected some of the most important texts in human history. If the more elite authors of the New Testament worked collaboratively, as I hope you now agree that they did, then the contributions of their co-authors are essential to our understanding of the life and message of Jesus. How did their insights, perspectives, and experiences shape the story that changed the world? Now, if it is true that the citizenship, religious commitments, education, and geographical location of a Christian author matters, and I know there are some Bible scholars here, so I know that you agree that it probably does matter, then enslaved literary collaborators should invite us to be attentive to issues of enslavement on the part of our authors. I want to give you an example of that, because without examples, it's like a meal without carbohydrates. It's very unsatisfying. There are lots of examples to choose from, but in closing, I want to pick one that is possibly familiar to you. In one well-known gospel story that has captured popular imagination since late antiquity, Jesus was at Peter's home in Capernaum when word got out that he was there. Locals swarm around him, filling the house where he was staying, spilling out into the courtyard outside. As Jesus spoke with this group, 4 men arrived carrying a portable bed. The man on the litter is identified in Mark only as a paralytikos, or in English translations, a paralytic. Seeing the crowd around the doorway, the 4 attempted a different approach. Having hoisted themselves and their charge onto the roof, they began to tunnel their way through it. They removed the web of supporting reeds to create an opening between the wooden beams and lowered the paralyzed man down into the room. Archaeologists remark on the shoddy craftsmanship of homes in Capernaum, but rudimentary construction skills are actually no excuse for vandalism. Nevertheless, Jesus seems to overlook it. Noting the 4's faith, he forgives the sins of the paralytic. After a brief but tense exchange with the assembled scribes, Jesus plays his trump card and instructs the paralyzed man to stand up, take his mat, and go to his home. Now, this story is filled with architectural and narrative gaps. The open doorway, the unplanned skylight in the roof, the unnoted destruction of someone's home, and the absence of names. Most noteworthy in their absence are the identities of the 4 who carried the paralytic. Greek idiom allows their identities to evaporate out of this story. As a consequence, generations of interpreters have sought to plug the gaps using materials imported from their own worlds. And so it is that some Bible translations and academic commentaries identify the 4 as the paralytic's friends. For those of you who don't read Greek, there's no reference to friends in the Greek here. And this is from the translation, not the commentary. But are they friends? Maybe, but maybe not. The sight of a person being carried was very common in antiquity because the wealthy were carried by their staff on bobbing sedan chairs and beds. To return to Pliny, For elites, they walked with the feet of others. It actually counted as exercise, being carried around outside in the fresh air. Some physicians prescribed it as medicine, but the practice was also used to transport people who were sick or unable to walk. So it's possible that the 4 people carrying the paralyzed man were indeed his friends, but there are some reasons to doubt it. The man is transported on a krabatos, a word that covers everything from a mat to an ornate couch. But the fact that the krabatos is imagined as sturdy enough to be lowered through the roof and that no fewer than 4 men carried it might suggest that it was on the heftier side, perhaps something more like a litter. We know that the man is paralyzed, but we should consider the possibility that he was also rich. The social logic of this passage might suggest that the 4 were enslaved workers. And so it is especially significant that Jesus' focus is on them, rather than on the man that they have brought. Jesus notes their pistis, their trustworthiness, one of the idealized traits of the so-called good slave in antiquity, their fidelity or faith. The authors of the story want us, the readers, to notice that the men are here and that, either through loyalty to their enslaver or through trust that they've placed in Jesus, they have distinguished themselves. His first words to the paralyzed man, on the other hand, take on a very different tone. He issues a somewhat barbed command, take up your krabatos and walk, and the man, who in my reading is more accustomed to giving orders than following them, does just that. That he can carry the couch does not necessarily lead to the conclusion that it's a yoga mat, and thus that he was impoverished. The krabatos is now empty. The story takes place in a world of wonder. He was just cured of paralysis. It's not a huge stretch to say he can carry the bed, too. Impressive displays of strength are not out of the question. What this reading does change is our understanding of the instruction. Jesus tells the now able-bodied enslaver to do his own work. He forestalls the possibility that the man might just hop back up on his litter and be carried home. This is one interpretation that attempts to make enslaved collaborators narratively visible. The bed is sturdy, but the man can carry it, as he can here. In antiquity, digging was seen as one of the most arduous and artless of enslaved tasks. Burrowing through a roof, however, is more complicated. Perform it incorrectly, and you take a tumble. It requires at least a tacit knowledge of engineering. It's possible that the paralyzed man directs this labor, but this does not mean that the work of the 4 men was mindless. No one is irrelevant and no one is fungible in this story. This much is obvious from the story itself. It's the 4's work that is seen and acknowledged by Jesus. Reparative work is in the gaps, in seeing and acknowledging those whom despotic curricula, history, and culture encourage us to see through. For almost 2,000 years, readers of the New Testament have agonized over the interpretation of every detail of the Jesus story. We excavate participles as if they were precious relics. The goal of the historian has been defined as an attempt to understand the meaning of ancient texts in their original contexts. The more optimistic among us attempt to uncover the intent of the authors who wrote them by attending to their presumed religious beliefs, experience, social mores, and ethnicities. Now, not everyone reads the Bible as an historian, but if historical reconstruction has merit, and as some of the New Testament's co-authors were invisible and servile, then those who do care about history should read the literature of the Jesus movement with this in mind. It may not be possible to credit low-status collaborators with specific interventions, but just as with tunneling through a roof, agency should be ascribed to everyone in the group. Thank you.
Thank you so much. much. We have time for questions. We have faculty in the room. We have grad students in the room. We have undergrads and alumni. I saw at least one alum in the room, so we've got a whole mix. And I welcome your questions. And Professor Moss, if you could, summarize the question before you answer it, just so those who are on the live stream can hear.
Can I change the question?
Of course, yes. You can take short.
I could.
So I'll let you, mind calling on your own question?
I do not mind.
Floor is open.
Would this same system of scribal slavery have been used in Judea prior to the Roman conquest, or would the Hebrew scriptures have been transcribed?
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. Would this have, basically, in essence, the question is this system used prior to Roman occupation, and would this apply to Hebrew scriptures? So our documentation for this, and my interest lies primarily with Greek and Roman culture. So that's what I looked at. And I don't think we have great documentation for what's happening with the Hebrew scriptures, but I do want to draw everyone's attention to a passage in the book of Tobit, which is not, strictly speaking, in the Hebrew Bible, but there are some Second Temple Jewish scholars here. It provides one of our only descriptions of how someone might combine two texts into a single text. So when you have the description of this classic heavenly scene where you have an angel who writes down good deeds and an angel who writes down bad deeds, and all of these deeds end up in a single book. And that suggests collaboration, multiple people involved in the writing of a single text. Now, obviously, this is a heavenly book. This may not apply, but presumably they're drawing on real writing technologies, and I really don't know why it is that when people talk about the composition of, say, the Pentateuch or the synoptic problem, we don't talk about multiple people being involved in that process. I could not have given this talk without the assistance of Max Hoa there, and I don't know that it would have been possible to combine the synoptics or the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible from 4 sources into a single source without the assistance of lots of people. Does that mean they're enslaved? Not necessarily. We do have a lot of rabbinic evidence about the use of kind of readers. A formal reader who's enslaved is a really useful tool. And because so many of us start to lose our vision, particularly at night as we get older, I know I'm not the only person embarrassing my children with the flashlight function on my phone. They often use much younger enslaved readers for that task. And I think there's some suggestion that that may be the case with the reading of texts in synagogues. I think Claudia Setz has done some really interesting work on this, but there's a lot more to come on what exactly is happening in sort of Jewish communities in the 1st and 2nd century CE. But there's also there is shorthand, Greek shorthand, among the remains from the Bar Kokhba rebels. So Greek shorthand is making its way into Jewish communities. Gentleman in the front, to whom I'm married.
Is there any examples you can give us of lifestyle of a enslaved worker that is different than the lifestyle of their master, and did the enslaver, and did the lifestyle make it into the written examples?
The question is there any distinctions between the lifestyle of an enslaver and an enslaved person? 1 or 2. And does that make it into the written record? So yes, there are big differences in their lifestyle. It's actually a surprisingly good question. I'm going to enjoy answering this. So to your first point, yes, of course, not least the fact that if you're an enslaver and if you're an elite male, you're probably not subject to the same kind of sexual violence as you are if you're an enslaved person. You also probably get to eat when you're hungry. You have control over your time. You get to stop reading at night because it's uncomfortable. You get to go to the bath. There's all kinds of things that made being an enslaver better and lifestyle was it better. But on the point is, does the enslaved experience make its way into the text? I think so. So I've written a piece that isn't out yet. It's been in press for 6.5 years on the ways in which enslavers regulate the sleep patterns and time of enslaved people. So they often have to sleep on the floor outside the bedrooms of enslaved people. I don't know if any of you have cats and are woken up by your cats in the night, but this is what sleep would have been like for enslaved people, constantly being disturbed and woken up to serve someone's whim. And the irony is that in Roman literature, there's a beautiful piece in the Met that shows this. Enslaved people are depicted as lazy and sleepy, but it's because they're being kept awake all the time. And they're not, and work so hard. Seneca says they stand around dinner parties, hungry and tired, unable to sit down. That idea, that kind of enslaved fatigue and enslaved tempo, classicist Tom Goy has written a piece about that working its way into Roman literature and this kind of rapid pace at which enslaved people have to function, changing the structure of Roman sentences. It's called Rush Job, if you're interested. I might be able to share it with you if you're nice.
Yeah, I'm curious, just kind of building off that, kind of the Greek and the New Testament that is often considered pretty poor, like our Revelation or Peter's epistles. Could this equally attest to like having enslaved scribe who's not as well educated in writing sentences and whatnot? I'm just curious for you.
Yeah, so there's a scholar called Jeremiah Coogan who's working on Revelation, and its enslaved origins. One of the interesting things about the mistakes in Revelation is that they would remind you, if you read a lot of inscriptions, of the kinds of mistakes made in inscriptions, which makes me wonder about what other forms of writing the person who wrote down Revelation is engaged in, because they're literate, for sure. And so, I don't think, ironically, I think enslaved people are probably the best educated, certainly better than the people to whom we traditionally ascribe this. And anyone who cares about, say, John the disciple having written the fourth gospel, according to tradition, he wrote that sort of in old age, possibly in his 90s. He had to have help. And so I don't know that I think that poor Greek necessarily comes from the enslaved scribes themselves. There are some really interesting examples gathered by Roger Bagnala and Raffaella Cribiori, in which the scribes improve things and then they get tired and they stop doing it. And there you start to see the dictation style of the author come through. And one of the things that authors do in that situation is they use kai a lot, which means and. So if you've read the Gospel of Mark, and you've noticed how everything happens and immediately, over and over again, that might be that kind of tick that comes out. A little bit like the way I say like and too much.
Journalist observation. In a way, it sounds like almost editing from below.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas today, you wouldn't think twice. We all know Maxwell Perkins, Hemingway, Robert Gottlieb, all these great editors who help shape things. I mean, we take that for granted. We don't doubt the artistry or great works of literature, but this seems like the same process, only it's from below, educating people from helping to shape it, but we get shocked. When we think that St. Paul may not have written that and.
It's true, but it's funny. You say, like, today we wouldn't be shocked. Sometimes when people try to catch me out about this, they're like, well, what about your books? You're the author, but there were editors, and they're not authors. Ha-ha. And my response to that is usually, they did authorial work. They made the book much better. Now, when I was going through the authorial process, and that editorial process with my editor, the copy editor, the proofer, the editorial assistant, all of these people who are all saving me from career-ending errors, I might add. Every time they introduce something that I don't like, I have a vivid, almost visceral reaction to that. Just like a Roman enslaver would, how dare they? Imbeciles. And yet I have very little recollection of the thousands of positive changes they made to the manuscript, and they did. And I think it's that kind of amnesia. And I think people are still quite invested in authors, particularly when it's your own status. But you're absolutely right. We shouldn't have a problem with it. We should acknowledge it. And though we wouldn't necessarily call everyone involved in my book an author, they all do authorial work, which is one of the reasons that when I published it, I asked the press to list every single assistant and every single person in the acknowledgements who had been involved, including the factory workers who had made the book.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for your answers to these questions and your generous gift of your time. And I want to remind everyone we have a reception and books to sign right outside. So we'll be out here for an hour, and Professor Moss, I'm sure would love to hear your questions and comments on this. Thank you.